let's talk about Neil Gaiman. Hello, if you are new here, my name is Anna. If you are not new here, my name is still Anna. This video is inspired by two different things. First and foremost, videos where booktubers talk about their favorite book series or their favorite author and give like a comprehensive guide. And it's also inspired by two recent videos on Pierre Ford's channel where she talks about beginner books for people who are just now getting into fantasy as opposed to intermediate fantasy books. I have been for a long time wanting to make a video involving just Neil Gaiman. So when I saw Pierre's videos talking about beginner fantasy novels and what books to read when it comes to that genre, I thought that would be a cool way to do a Neil Gaiman centric video and kind of give you a guide to Neil Gaiman. Because I feel like with Neil Gaiman, there are so many weird things about his novels that if you jump into the wrong novel right from the get-go, you're not going to appreciate how he writes and the stories he comes up with. Because I know for me personally, the first book I read by him technically was The Ocean at the End of the Lane, which I would now consider a book that you should not read as your first Neil Gaiman book because it is just, it's a little more out there. I remember DNFing it and thinking, I'm never reading anything by this man again. And then I read my first book by him, which I would still say is probably not a book that you should begin with. But I ended up enjoying it to the point where now I am obsessed with him. And I definitely get that Neil Gaiman is not for everyone, which is another reason why I wanted to make this video and tell you guys 3 books that I think you should read by him first and foremost before you dive into his other books. Foremost, I think that one of the easiest books to dive into when it comes to Neil Gaiman would be Coraline. This is probably my least favorite of the Neil Gaiman books that I have read, but I will say that it does introduce you to some of the motifs that Neil Gaiman uses quite a lot. In my opinion, this is probably his most famous and popular book, simply because I know people who are fans of the movie or who just know of the story of Coraline in general but have never necessarily heard of Neil Gaiman himself. They just know the story. And while I will say Good Omens is probably the contender for like the next most popular book, this one, just for the sheer amount of people who know of Coraline and not Neil Gaiman, I would say this is probably his most popular work. So this follows Coraline Jones, who is a young girl who moves into a brand new home with her parents, and she very quickly becomes bored. There's not really anyone around that is her age to play with her, and she gets bothered by all of her neighbors, so she decides to start exploring her own new home, and she discovers this tiny little door in the corner of a room that she is not supposed to go into. So naturally, being a child, she goes into that room, and she decides to go through the door, which leads her to a parallel universe that looks exactly like the area in which she currently lives, but she experiences this woman named the Other Mother, who is claiming to be her real true mother. So from there, Coraline has to decide whether or not she wants to live with this other mother who can give her everything she wants and make all her wildest dreams come true, or if she decides to go back and live with her parents and kind of the repercussions of her choice that she makes. So this book I would consider more middle grade or like for younger teenagers, but really I think anybody can enjoy this. I have met so many people who love this book as adults, and while I didn't necessarily enjoy it as much as his other books, I still did like it. You have all of the weird and kind of creepy vibes that Neil Gaiman puts in his books. You have some motifs that show up quite a lot in his other books. Like rats show up a lot in his books, but rats are never a bad thing from the books that I have read at least. And you also see cats being sort of like a moral compass show up in this book, which is another motif. This book also gives a great example of one of my favorite things that Neil Gaiman does with books that involve children. He presents you with this topic, and while it seems like the story up front is just about this magical, crazy thing that happened, you can really dive a little bit deeper into it and begin to process, is this a way that this child is like coping with a traumatic life experience, or is it really just whimsy and wonder? Out of all of his books, I do think that this is more par for the course when it comes to other books that are similar to it. I know there are a lot of like weird, twisty YA and middle grade books that are similar to this one, and therefore I do think it is like a good diving in entry point to Neil Gaiman, because this book does give you a dose of the dark humor and like dark themes that Neil typically talks about in his books, but it also gives it to you in like a middle grade, small dosage kind of way. Next up on this list is a book that is one of my favorite Neil Gaiman books, probably within my top 3. That is The Graveyard Book. This is another middle grade book, and out of the 3 books in this video, I do think that this is the one that is like the most Neil Gaiman-y if that makes sense. At the very beginning of this novel, a family is murdered in their own home and their baby miraculously survives the incident but is nowhere to be found. Unbeknownst to everyone in the world around them, this baby has crawled out of his crib and made his way across the street into the nearby graveyard, where the ghosts and the inhabitants of this graveyard decide to raise them as his own to protect him from the secret society group called the Jack of All Trades. This novel, I would say, is a beginner Neil Gaiman novel because it is, like Coraline, technically a children's story, so it's very easy for anyone to get into and read, but there are key characteristics and elements of this book that are present in other Neil Gaiman books, and I feel like if you like those in this book, you're going to love them in all his other books. First and foremost, one of my favorite things about any Neil Gaiman book is that you also follow the villains, and those are more so in other books, but you do get glimpses of it in this book. So not only are you following Bod, but you also get to see perspectives from the Jack of All Trades as they are looking for Bod. And you also get scenes with side characters who are obviously not as important as the main character, but they do play a key role in the story. So you get these like little extra bonus adventures, it seems like, in the story, which Neil does a lot in other books, especially American Gods. Another reason I would say that this is a beginner Neil Gaiman book is because Neil likes to play a lot with ambiguity and like the unknown. He particularly does this in another novel of his called The Ocean at the End of the Lane, but that comes into play a little bit into this book as well. Not only is Bod surrounded by ghosts in this graveyard, but you also get to meet a very interesting character, and honestly one of my favorite Neil Gaiman characters. His name is Silas, and throughout the entire novel, it's never really explained who he is or what he is. You just know that he is Bod's protector, and he goes away for days on end, and he only comes back at night. It's very easy if you read the book to tell what Silas is meant to be. It's not necessarily a hidden thing, but it's never spoken aloud because Bod doesn't necessarily know. But it's one of my favorite elements of this book. It also happens a little bit in other books like Neverwhere and American Gods, but as far as beginner books go, this is the one that features the most of it. Speaking of withholding information though, that is also an element of Stardust, which is my third and final book I'm going to be mentioning in this video. The Stardust is not necessarily my favorite Neil Gaiman book. I know I said that about Coraline as well. This one I still love, but it's hard for me to wrap my head around the fact that Neil Gaiman actually wrote this because it feels a little bit different than his other works, which is another reason why I'm recommending it. It feels more like a fairy tale than it does like a dark fantasy novel. For the most part, Neil's books feel more like dark fantasy or dark fiction with a slight bit of fantasy, maybe like dark magical realism, but this book is not very dark. It does have dark undertones and themes, but for the most part it's a light and happy fairy tale about a young boy who is literally chasing a falling star because he wants to win over this love that lives in his town. So I would definitely recommend Stardust for people who are not necessarily someone who likes dark undertones in literature. This is definitely, as I said a second ago, more light and happy, but it does have key elements of Neil Gaiman books that I think that if you read it in this context and you enjoyed it, you would read it in other books and also enjoy it. As I mentioned a second ago, just like the Graveyard book, there is a sense of ambiguity. So Stardust follows a young boy named Tristan, and throughout the entire novel, Tristan really doesn't know how he came to be. Obviously he knows who his dad and his mother are, but there's some strangeness surrounding the way that he was conceived. So there's a lot of talk about that at the very beginning of the novel, and throughout the rest of it you get other scenarios where Tristan really has no idea what he's doing, and other characters have the information that could help him, but they just assume he knows it, so they don't tell him, and therefore don't tell you. Some other key elements of Stardust that pop up in other Neil Gaiman books are things like night markets, or just markets in general. The town that Tristan comes from is this town called Wall, and it literally is just this normal town surrounded by a wall, and everything on the outside of it is the land of fairy, where like magic happens, crazy stuff goes on. No one is allowed to enter the town of Wall, and no one from the town of Wall is allowed to leave. But once every year, there is a springtime kind of like night market situation where people from Fairy and people from Wall will gather outside of the city and have a market where they can share goods with each other. Another Neil Gaiman novel that features a market setting is Neverwhere, which I feel like the floating market in Neverwhere is one of the like most famous and iconic Neil Gaiman ideas that he's come up with. So the fact that this had a market in it and Neverwhere did as well is just a motif that I enjoyed. Neil also has this thing about cats and rats in his books. I talked a little bit about that with Coraline. You have cats and rats in that book, but you also have them in here. There's a character in here who's kind of like a guiding light for Tristan, and he's not necessarily a rat, but he is a rodent of some kind. It's never specifically specified. But as we established earlier, rats in Neil Gaiman's books are typically good things. You have royal rats in Neverwhere, you have a circus of rats in Coraline, and in this book you have a character that is a little bit tricky, but he's also not necessarily bad. And Tristan looks up to him. So while he's not necessarily considered a rat, he is rodent-like in some ways, and so throwing that out there. Cats, though, there's a character who is slightly feline in her ears, and you only really get to meet her a couple times, but she is a major character throughout the novel. She is also a guiding force in Tristram in more ways than you'd expect, especially in ways that you don't think they would be. That comes into play in this book as well. You also in Stardust get like the dual perspectives, where you're really following like this main set of characters, but you also get glimpses into like the bad guys. So Tristram is trying to find the fallen star in order to fall in love, and you also have this set of princes who are just cutthroat, and they're trying to find the fallen star so that they can take over the kingdom. And I know for a fact that there are other authors that do that, but it's one of my favorite things that Neil does, and I think he does it really well, so I wanted to include that in this video as well. So those are the 3 books that I would recommend reading if you have never read anything by Neil Gaiman before, or you have and you're just looking for like an easier read to get into. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know. I do plan on making 2 follow-up videos for this, featuring like more intermediate books and then more like advanced Neil Gaiman books. That sounds really pretentious, but I can't think of another adjective for it. So be on the lookout for those. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys are staying safe during this COVID-19 crisis. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.